Hello, Tom.
Hello.
Thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to take this interview with you. Would you be so kind to explain and give us a little bit of insight about your theory, about your work, and about your experience?
All right. Sure, I can do that. I am a physicist. I am also a consciousness researcher, and I have spent about the equal amount of time in both of those careers. I spent about 50 years doing physics and about 50 years doing consciousness research. My research in consciousness led me to write a book that was primarily a theory of consciousness. But in understanding consciousness, I realized that consciousness was fundamental and that the physical world was not. The physical world was a subset of the subjective world of consciousness. Out of that subjective world of consciousness, the physical world is born. Having understood that, after I completed my theory of consciousness, I realized that the very same principles that explain consciousness and how it works and what it can do and what its limitations are and so on, what its purpose is, also explained physics. The things in physics that were unknown, the paradoxes in physics. Two of those biggest paradoxes were why is the speed of light a constant, which is the underlying unknown under relativity theory, and why is it that you can best describe quantum mechanics in terms of particles being probability rather than particles being particles. Particles are represented as potential particles with a probability of being, one place or another. So that leads to the measurement problem that has been kind of plaguing quantum mechanics since the early 1920s when quantum mechanics started. And these same principles that explain consciousness also explained both of those mysteries. And pause for a minute for the thunder. And after finding success at explaining both of those, I started looking at the other paradoxes in physics, of which there are many. There's a Zeno paradox about if you measure an atom in a particular state, let's say this atom can be in state A or state B, and it takes maybe a minute is the 50-50 probability time that it would change states. But if you measure it every 10 seconds, it never changed state. It always stays in the same state. And that was called the Zeno paradox. And there was dozens of these paradoxes in science, some of them in biology. And I found that this consciousness theory could explain all of them. So in the last 30 years, I've been looking for things that it can't explain. And I've run across a few of those. And then, after a little bit of study, found that indeed it could explain those. So I'm still looking for things that it can't explain and haven't found anything yet. So I call this a big toe because it's not only a toe, which was defined by Einstein as a theory of everything, and he meant a theory that would combine or that would show the connection between quantum mechanics and relativity. That was his toe, because if you could understand quantum mechanics and relativity under one scientific set of principles, then he thought you would have the big theory of everything. But he was leaving out something very important, and that was the subjective world. And mine's a big toe because it's bigger than Einstein's little toe, and that is that it is a theory of everything, including everything subjective as well as everything objective. And the objective world becomes just a subset of that subjective world. It's the subset that has small uncertainty associated with it. The uncertainties are very small. As it turns out, there is really no objective world. And we've just seen a recent physics experiment that just was made public about 2 or 3 weeks ago, where they completed a thought experiment that the scientist Wigner had back in the 1920s, and they were able to actually do that experiment, and the result was that there is no objective reality, which is what I've been saying for the last 15 years or so. So kind of a short roundup is that consciousness is fundamental. Everything else is virtual. Consciousness is the source, if you will. We live in a virtual reality, which has almost become something you can talk about openly these days. There's a lot of people making movies about it, and people with large followings that are talking about virtual reality. But mostly they talk about it in terms of we are a virtual reality created by our future selves. You know, so humans in the future are creating this reality about this virtual reality about their past, and we're the players in it. That just doesn't hold water, and it's not very logical. It's not easy to defend that. But that position is taken because they cannot come up with any other explanation. That's still physical. The better explanation is looking at a virtual reality in the same way that we create virtual realities. In the virtual realities we create a virtual world by computing it in a computer, and it creates avatars created by the computer, and then a person called a player with consciousness makes all the choices for that avatar. That's really a better model for a virtual reality. And using that model, then we, you and I, our bodies and these chairs are all computed in a virtual reality, and we are not our bodies, but we are consciousness, players playing these bodies. And why would we do that? Because our purpose here is to evolve consciousness. And I talk about a thing I call the larger consciousness system. And the larger consciousness system is just the overall consciousness, the source of everything else. And it evolves by lowering its entropy, because the consciousness system is an information system. If a system has bits and they're all random, there is no information. As there is order among the bits, as there's pattern among the bits, then information is created out of that order and pattern. So as entropy is reduced, high entropy being all random, lower entropy being pattern within that randomness, then that system evolves. It maintains itself. It can go regular time, it can make sequence of patterns. So that then can evolve toward lower entropy states. It's a self-generating evolution, like all evolution. You take the output, feed it in to the evolution as an input, and it evolves a little more each time, trying to create a little lower entropy, rearranging the bits to create a little lower entropy. So consciousness evolved, and as it evolved, its entropy lowered, but it got to a point where that rate of entropy reduction was starting to become asymptotic. It was starting to slow down. And it was able to overcome that slowdown by creating other pieces of consciousness with which it could interact. Now, consciousness only can exist with free will. If there is no free will, there is no consciousness. And free will and consciousness can only exist if there is time, because consciousness makes choices. And choices is before the choice and after the choice. You need time. Evolution requires time. Things don't evolve, and that lowering entropy evolution can't happen without time. And if there's no free will, there's no choice. Free will, everything's deterministic, and there is no choice. Okay, so in the path that I've taken, there is free will, there is time, and there is consciousness. So the system that was slowing down in its entropy reduction broke into pieces, if you will, broke apart some subsets of itself so that it could interact with those subsets, because now the potential of those interactions was much greater than just a system interacting with itself. And it could break itself in many of these pieces. And that's what you and I are. We're these subsets of consciousness. I call those individuated units of consciousness. And we have a mission, and that is to lower entropy. We're part of the strategy of the consciousness system to evolve. Well, what we do as consciousness, as information systems, is create information, share information. So I send you information, you send me information. We interact with each other. But if that's all we're doing, it's got very few consequences. So evolving the quality of our consciousness doesn't have much stress in that situation. There's very little to push it or prod it into new states, other than just the kind of the concept, the idea, the very abstract idea of lowering entropy. So the system decided that it needed to give us a system that we could interact in, a subsystem that we could interact in that had more definition, more rules, more structure, in which the structure creates choice. Choice with consequences. So this reality that we call our physical universe was then a creation of consciousness. It started with a rule set. We call, our science tries to find out what the rules are. That's what physics, chemistry, biology are all sciences that try to find out what are the rules in the rule set that governs this reality. So that's the rule set. And it started out with initial conditions. And those initial conditions were a very small ball of plasma at very high temperature, very high pressure, and that starts to sound like Big Bang Theory. Well, this is big digital bang theory because it's a simulation. And with that initial conditions and those rules, you punch the run button and the computer starts to evolve. That is, according to the rule set, those initial conditions change. And as we know, that little ball of plasma expanded, cooled, turned into suns, then planets, and so on. That's where the physical universe comes from. So our physical universe was not programmed, it was evolved. It just evolved. And eventually it evolved us. And here we are, creating virtual realities, of course, of our own. That's because the virtual reality is kind of part of our foundation. It's part of our thing. Evolution is what I call a process fractal. It's like a geometric fractal in that you take a fundamental, in this case, a fundamental process rather than a fundamental equation or geometric shape, and you keep feeding the input to the output, taking those same, that same process, and keep iterating on the process, much as you iterate on a small equation in a geometric fractal, a little geometric equation. So you end up with a process fractal, and process fractal, like any fractal, any piece of the fractal shows you the fundamentals of the whole. Each piece of it represents the fundamental information. So we see these ideas keep repeating themselves. So we are creating virtual realities now, and that would be inevitable because we would inevitably find rules of the rule set. We would inevitably find zeros and ones that we could stack together in a pattern, then create computation, and then create virtual realities. So that's just a short idea of kind of a theory of consciousness. This larger consciousness system's the source. We are units of that consciousness playing avatars in a virtual reality. Now that sounds very fanciful. It sounds very, very strange, but it's amazing how many problems that solves. Why is C a constant? Because in any virtual reality, you can only move one delta x in one delta t. One, if you like, a pixel of distance for one pixel of time. And that is as fast as you can move anything through a virtual reality without jumping, over pixels, without teleporting. Well, a virtual reality that makes a good schoolhouse like ours, teleporting around makes it very discontinuous, and you don't have continuous functions that way. You don't have you don't have a continuous history of causality if things can jump around like that. You have a very complex causality. So that is the thumbnail sketch of what the theory is. Now, there is actually derivations of all of that goes into logical detail. The books, trilogy of books that I've explained this in, called My Big Toe, it derives the things I've just said. I've taken 10 minutes to basically skim across the top, but these books will actually logically derive all of that to make it logically plausible. And there's only two assumptions in it. One assumption is that we are conscious, basically that consciousness exists. That's not a big leap, since, here we are consciously talking about things. The other assumption is that evolution exists, that if you have a system that can change itself, against a requirement like lowering entropy, or in our simulation, survival and procreation, those were the criteria. In the consciousness system, lowering entropy is the criteria. So something that's self-changing with a criteria that defines positive change versus negative change, that system will evolve. It will change itself to ensure its survival, more efficient processes. And with consciousness, that means more information, lower entropy. So that's it, very quickly, not derived, just making statements across the top. But it is logical, and it is derived, and it does answer lots and lots of questions. It answers the question in quantum mechanics: why should particles be probability distributions? Well, this virtual reality is not a deterministic reality. It's not made from calculations starting with elementary particles, building those up into atoms, taking atoms and building those up into molecules, and molecules building them up into the macro world. That is inefficient. That's a tremendous calculation. To calculate that based on elementary particles, it would probably take 10 supercomputers, a month just to compute my arm going up in the air and down, something that trivial, much less everything that happens in this reality. That's way too much calculation to be useful. This simulation is a probabilistic simulation. It's based on probability. That is much more efficient. Now, it has a rule set, and that rule set can generate the probability distributions of the way things could possibly happen. And with those probability distributions, you can simplify running the simulation just by taking samples out of those probability distributions. And the way that's done, when something new comes into the simulation, the system, and by something new, I mean a telescope looks someplace that no scope ever looked before, somebody digs a hole in the ground and nobody's ever looked at what's in that soil before. At least it's not known what's in that soil. It's all about information. There's no information here that says what is going to be there. Then the system has to put something there. It has to render something in that virtual reality. It takes all of the possibilities that could be there and the probability of each possibility, and then it takes a random draw from that probability distribution of the possibilities, and that's what's in the whole. That's what's out in outer space. Now, there's a couple constraints. It just can't put anything in the hole or anything in outer space. one constraint is it has to be consistent with what we know before, past facts, with history. So that's one constraint. It can't be something that doesn't fit in. And secondly, it can't be something that is in violation of the rule set. But often there's many things that meet those two constraints. There's often not just one thing that meets that constraint. For instance, the telescope looking at outer space, there's probably thousands of different configurations of things that would meet those two criteria. You know, it's not opposed to the rule set, and it's not opposed to the history that we know. So out of all of those thousands of things, some are more probable than others. And that random draw is taken out of the probability distribution. Now, a random draw doesn't mean you just take randomly one of those possibilities. When you take a random draw from a probability distribution, it's more likely to get things that are more probable than things that are less probable. But sometimes you can draw the thing that's not too probable. And that's what then that scientist would see with their telescope. Now, after they see it and they've taken their pictures, anybody else looks there will have to see the same thing, because that now is part of history, which makes it one of the constraints of what has to be seen next. So that's the way the system generates new things. So it opens up a lot of possibilities of how this reality works. The things that were previously called paranormal, like remote viewing, precognitive dreams, things that have been around a long time, and there's a lot of research been done on them. Healing with the mind, all these things now are just normal, because in a world based upon consciousness, these things aren't unusual at all. They're just understandable, and you can understand everything about them. You can understand why they sometimes don't work. You can understand why they work better for some people than others. You can understand what their limits are, what they can do, what they can't do. It makes fields that were very mysterious well known. Also, they explain people's experiences. People have lots of subjective experiences. And when these experiences are unusual, there is often an explanation for them. I mean, the explanation may just be random dream, but sometimes they're more than that, like the precognitive dream. And this offers a solution for that sort of thing, an explanation for how people can obtain information that they can't obtain, in normal ways. As well as, why does the double slit experiment work? Well, why does that double slit experiment work? Because it's only a potential particle until that information defining that particle is in somebody's data stream. See, we consciousnesses, we individuated units of consciousness, get a data stream, and we interpret that data stream to be our reality. All virtual realities work that way. If you're playing The Sims or World of Warcraft, you get a data stream. That data stream goes to your computer. That computer displays a whole bunch of dots of light on your monitor. You look at all those dots of light and you interpret those dots as a reality with things in it, rocks and trees and water and your character, your avatar, your elf. So ours works in a similar way. So until that data stream is sent to your computer that shows you something in that reality, it isn't in the reality. It's got to go to somebody who's a player. Some player has to get the data. That's what explains the observer effect. Why is the observer key in the double slit experiment? It's because that particle isn't here in this reality, in this virtual reality, until it shows up in somebody's data stream. And that happens when somebody makes a measurement. So when they make a measurement, they find, a particle. Okay. Now, there's only a probability of a particle until they make the measurement. And the measurement, as you say, is where the particle is created in this reality. Now in quantum mechanics, they say that the wave function collapses to a particle when you make the measurement. Okay? But they really don't know why that makes sense. It makes sense because this is a probabilistic virtual reality. That's how it has to come here. And why do those particles distribute themselves in a diffraction pattern when there's really no forces acting on them? Well, that's because the system, in order to keep the virtual reality consistent, has a boundary problem between waves and particles. So the particles have to meet that boundary because light is both. You can do experiments with light as a wave, you can do experiments with light as particles. And at the boundary where those two meet, you have to have consistency. So the particles, in order for the system to stay consistent, have to arrange themselves in a diffraction pattern, because that's what you get when you put waves through those slits. So that's why the particles do that. The system needs to stay consistent. That's one of its constraints. That's why you have the constraint of rule set and history. It basically comes out of the one requirement to maintain consistency in the virtual reality. So we're here to make choices, and by those choices we either evolve by lowering our entropy or de-evolve by raising our entropy. And as our entropy, individual entropy, goes up and down, so does the system's energy go up and down because we're part of that system. So that's kind of the overview.
Can I ask you a question about the experiment you try and set up and run this year to back up your theory?
Sure. I have a couple of quantum mechanics experiments, just normal, everyday quantum mechanics experiments. They're variations on the double split, but variations that have never been done before. And if these experiments work the way I think they will, then they will make a very strong statement. Basically, they will create strong evidence. Science is about evidence. Science is not about proof, it's about evidence. Proof is a different thing. I had a friend that says, proof is for whiskey. Science does evidence. Well, it'll produce strong evidence that this is a virtual reality. And it will also produce evidence that this virtual reality is based on consciousness. So trying to get these physics experiments done, and I will get them done sooner or later, but it's a little troublesome trying to find somebody willing to do them, because science today claims that it only applies to the objective world. Consciousness is obviously subjective. Science doesn't want to be seen doing things that aren't science. So people don't want to do experiments that have something to do with consciousness, even though they're just ordinary double slit type physics experiments. They don't want to be associated with working on something that has something to do with subjective reality rather than objective reality. But we're working on it, and we no doubt will do them, and when we do them, the results, whether they come out the way I hope or not, will be put up on YouTube so that everybody can see how they come out. So these experiments, the ones that are most dramatic, there's several that probe some of the fundamentals of quantum mechanics. Those fundamentals, I think, are right now wrong in quantum mechanics. And these experiments will point out those errors, which will be interesting all in itself. But the things that are most dramatic, that's not the most dramatic thing. The most dramatic thing is that these experiments will allow some rather major, should we say, miracles to occur. Just like the double slit is kind of a miracle occurs, right? The particles all arrange themselves as in a diffraction pattern when there's no forces on them for them to do that. So you look at that and say, well, what's going on there? So I'm calling that a miracle. All I mean is something that nobody can understand how it could possibly happen. So mine will also do a miracle like that, except it'll be a little stronger miracle than just putting particles in various positions. it will allow the researcher to predict whether a particle will reflect or will transmit, say through a beam splitter. So if a photon gets to a thing called a beam splitter, 50% of the time it should reflect and 50% of the time it should transmit. The thing is just made that way to do that, but it's random. Nobody knows which way it will go. Actually, nobody can know. That is impossible. So it would take a miracle to be able to predict that. To predict that, you know, not just once, but you know, just predict all of the particles that get there. You can predict what they're going to do. So that's one miracle. The other would be to predict how an atom is going to decay. Atoms decay and they shoot out some sort of energy when they decay. They go from a higher energy state to a lower energy state, and that difference in energy flies out of the particle as something else, like a beta or an alpha particle or something shoots out. Maybe a smaller particle than that, but anyway, there's always the emission. That's called radiation. That's why, you know, particles decays creates radiation. So that radiated particle comes out randomly in any direction. So here's the atom, and it could come out this way or that way or down here, and it's completely random. And one of my experiments will allow the experimenter to predict the way that comes out. Whether it comes out, we're going to put a Geiger counter on either side, hemisphere around either side, and it'll predict whether it'll come out on this Geiger counter or that Geiger counter, which again is impossible. So those are more dramatic in the sense that they actually involving physical things that interact, massy things that are interacting, not just small particles that nobody can see rearranging their position. So it makes it a little stronger. So these should be done, I would hope, in another, you know, they could be done as quick as the next several months. If plans, you know, if present plans work, they'll be done in a few months. If not, they'll probably be done within a year. Anyway, and then we'll know whether they work out that way or not. So that's coming. Stay tuned.
Okay. May I ask a couple questions about the practical application of your theory, since it's not just physical science theory, but it's theory of consciousness as well. How can people apply your theory in everyday life?
Okay, well, that's a very important question, because in my estimation, the importance and significance of this theory isn't even the science. You'd think showing things that were incorrect in quantum mechanics and having experiments that show things that are unusual would be the really big deal. But in my estimation, that's not the really big deal. It is going to affect science. It explains a lot of things in science which affect science. But the biggest deal is that it explains people. It explains us. Because it explains why we're here and what our purpose is. It explains an awful lot about how it is you find happiness and satisfaction here. You find happiness and satisfaction when you're serving that purpose. That's the way the system is set up. And when you're not serving that purpose, you find pain and unhappiness. So the biggest and most important thing about it, that it's about people. It's about their lives. It's about how to optimize your life, how to find that happiness, how to have a good relationship, what's important and what's not. And it comes down to, and I'm skipping a bunch of logical steps to get here, but it comes down to fear is a high entropy thing. Fear is high entropy, and on the opposite side of fear is love, and that's low entropy. So we're here to lower our entropy can be translated into we're here to become love, to let go of fear. And I've just jumped to that conclusion, but there is a logical process in the books that kind of derives that conclusion. So that means if you are fearful, like most of us are, and I don't mean fears in the intellect, I mean fears at your core. Fears and create things called belief and ego. ego is defined as awareness in the service of fear. Beliefs are pretty obvious, things you believe without information, really, without knowledge. You just believe them. Both of those things are the problem. You need to get rid of the fear and get rid of the beliefs. The way to approach all life is with open-minded skepticism. And that means you are open to things you don't know, and that you are skeptical of everything. And the thing you have to be most skeptical of is yourself. So skepticism is important. And I would encourage all the listeners out there that are listening to this interview to not believe anything that I say. But I'd also encourage them not to disbelieve anything that I say, because both of those are just beliefs. That won't take them anyplace important. They should find out about it themselves. If it's not your experience, it's not your truth. So there's plenty of things in my theory that you can measure, that you can do to see if it works. And you and I and other people here have been sitting here just talking about such things. And we've had plenty of people here doing things that show them that it does indeed work. There are things that you can do with your mind that will convince you that the theory that I have is a good theory. Now, I would caution everybody, besides not believing or disbelieving, also to realize that this theory is metaphorical. When I talk about the larger consciousness system, that's a metaphor for the source. When I talk about individuated units of consciousness, that's a metaphor for consciousness, like you and I. We talk about other things like free will awareness unit. They're all metaphorical. Okay, these metaphors are required when you talk about things like this in order to give us some way to discuss it. You need to name things and give them functions. So the model was built looking at the functions of consciousness from my research in consciousness. What can consciousness do and not do? What are the major players? Making a minimalist set of just those things necessary, get rid of all the things that aren't necessary, and look at the functions that consciousness must perform. And then at each major function, I give it a name, like larger consciousness system or individuated unit of consciousness, and describe that function and how it acts and interacts with other functions, and that's how the model's built. So this is built on a model that's computer-based. Consciousness is an information system. That's a metaphor. That doesn't mean that it's binary. It could be anything. Any base would do. It doesn't mean that it's traditional computing or quantum computing. It just means it's an information system. So I can talk about ones and zeros, which are basically binary, but that's just a metaphor for how computers work. I don't necessarily mean the system has to be binary, you see. So all of these terms I'm using that I define in my books are metaphors for functions that I have, I wouldn't say discovered, they've been around for a long time, but that I talk about in my books. And that then allows me to derive other things. I guess one thing I should mention that's of interest is that the way the system has to render this virtual reality that we call our physical universe requires it to create some databases. So it has the data it needs when it gets the calculations that it has to do the rendering. And part of that process ends up giving us the ability to modify future probability, so that we, with our intent, we can modify the probability of future states. So a future state may have you being more healthy or less healthy, say, in the future. We can modify that with our intent to raise or lower those probabilities. That's how healing works. So that's just a one of the key ideas, and those databases then give us a future probability database, a database of all the things that could happen and the probability that they would, and that's where things like precognitive dreams come from. And as time goes on, that future probable database becomes the past database of everything that could have happened and the probability that it would have, plus a little thread of what actually did happen, what we chose, all our choices were to happen. And that database then lets us get it lets us remote view because we're getting data out of a database. So it lets us do other things. And these structures are also metaphorical because they provide, the functionality that I have found in the consciousness system. So all in all, it's a big Tao, describes everything, objective and subjective, and it seems to describe personal experience as well as physics better than the descriptions we have now. So I published it in 2003. It's been around now for about 15 years. I just put it out there and kind of let it be. Thought if it was worthwhile, people would find it and tell other people, and they have. So now I've been around the world giving lectures and so on for the last 10 years or so, and it's grown to be more widely known. So that's what brings us together, right?
Hopefully it will be translated in Ukrainian and
I
Russian.
hope so. That would be wonderful.
Can I ask you about conflicts and wars? Do you think your theory could help somehow to, if not to prevent, but at least understand people how they can handle these conflicts?
Sure. The reason we have these conflicts is because the general, what I call quality of consciousness, which is the quality is really a measure of the entropy, high entropy being a low quality of consciousness, low entropy being a high quality of consciousness, so that the quality of consciousness is relatively low in our, among humans. Really among critters in general, it's kind of low. And we're here to change that, to lower our entropy, raise the quality of our consciousness. And because it's low, we have a lot of self-centeredness, we have a lot of belief, we have a lot of choices being made that aren't being made toward becoming love. They're being made because that's good for me. And that's the root of the problem. And the wars and the things we see going on, they are an accurate reflection of that condition. They are a good representation of the quality of consciousness of humanity. So the way we change that is by growing up, becoming less dominated by our ego and our beliefs. That's how we change it. And until we do that, we can't change it. We can, change a politician here or there, or change laws and things, but it really won't change anything other than for a short time. We are still going to have the same dysfunction we have until we grow up, until we raise the quality of our consciousness. But the good news is that in this evolutionary process, that quality is continually growing. And the more we grow up, the easier it is to grow up even more. And in the last 300 years or so, we've made a lot of progress toward becoming a kinder, gentler place. Not only for humans, but for the environment and for all the animals in it than we had been before. So we are making progress. But even better news is that we finally, just in the last couple of decades, put together all the pieces that are necessary for this growth to speed up, to grow much faster than it has been in the past. And that is, the world has become a much smaller place. We can look into the faces of people all over the planet and what they're experiencing. News and ideas travel quickly. It used to be that somebody had a brilliant idea someplace, well, he and people 20 miles around him found out about it and nobody else knew. Ideas were all local. And yes, they would grow some, but as they grow, they'd be diluted and changed. And it was very difficult to have communication across wide groups. You know, and then we got radio, and then we got TV, and now we have the internet. And now things, as they say, happen on internet time, which means that everything's sped up a whole lot because communications and interaction is sped up a whole lot. And now we have a large minority of physicists who think virtual reality is the right answer, as far as they think it's the way our reality is. When I published these books in 2003, me and maybe 2 or 3 other people in science thought that that was a rational idea, and everybody else thought it was crazy. And now, a very large majority, and many of them are at the best institutions, think that virtual reality is the right answer because that's what their experiments are saying. From the double slit experiment that started this, it can't be a material reality because particles are probability. They're not material. They couldn't rearrange themselves without any forces on them because that's impossible in a material reality. Therefore, it's not a material reality. Well, that festered for a long time. But since then, hundreds of other experiments have been done that confirm the same thing. So you'll find a lot of physicists these days that will agree that this reality is information-based. It's information-based. That means it's computed. That means it's a simulation. That means it's a virtual reality. So the idea that we're living in an information-based reality has grown from almost nothing to the biggest groundswell, I guess, change in science since Newton, since quantum mechanics. So that's becoming accepted. And in another couple of decades, it'll be a majority. Most physicists will agree that this is an information-based reality because the experiments tell us that. Right now, we have a lot of people in denial, but that's because it's hard for them to understand. This being a virtual reality seems such a bizarre idea. 20 years from now, most of us will be having experienced virtual realities. They're just about as real as this one. You'll be putting on your headgear, getting on your platform, that maybe blows air at you and maybe even puts odors in. You'll have some real sophisticated virtual realities that will be very difficult to tell whether they're more or less real than this reality. They'll be just about as real. And when most of us experience things like that, the idea that this could be a virtual reality won't be such a hard sell. It'll be, well, of course, that makes sense. I mean, look at the physics experiments. They've been telling us that for almost 100 years. And the resistance to that idea will melt. So we're going that way, and physicists in general will go that way. Well, when physics gets to the point that they say this is a virtual reality, that means that we are a subset of something larger. Virtual realities don't compute themselves. They have to be computed in some other reality frame. You see? The player has to be in some other reality frame. Take the World of Warcraft, virtual reality. Okay? From the elf's point of view, the computer that computes it is non-physical. From the elf's point of view, that World of Warcraft reality is what's physical. That's where the trees and rocks and streams and buildings are that he has to deal with, and they all seem very physical. So the computer appears to be outside that virtual reality. It has to be outside that virtual reality. You can't have a computer inside the virtual reality that it computes. It would just be a virtual computer, you see. So the computer has to be outside the virtual reality. The player has to be outside the virtual reality. So now we have science coming to a conclusion that we're a subset of something bigger, something that is computing us, and that big superset is non-physical to us. And that is just the nature of virtual reality. Any virtual reality idea has to come to that conclusion. Well, that's a really big thing to say for science, to say there's something non-physical and it's the source of our reality. But that is the only logical place to be in if indeed this is a virtual reality. Nothing else makes nearly as much sense. So in another decade or two, this concept will come and become public. Scientists agree that this is an information-based reality. There's something more powerful and fundamental than physical. There's something non-physical, where the computation has to take place. That's going to stir up a hornet's nest of speculation and ideas and people saying, I knew that all the time. Religions are going to want to own that. My God's a better computer than a better programmer than your God. We're going to have a lot of turmoil there for a while. But if we come out the other end of it with the idea that this is a virtual reality and we're here to become love, we're here to care about other, not about self. That's what makes us happy. That's what gives us pleasure and satisfaction. And that is where, we're going. That's where evolution is taking us. Then indeed that would go a long way to raise the quality of consciousness of the people. It would travel fast because we have internet. That internet will even be more pervasive a couple of decades from now. And that has the power to make all the difference in the world about us growing up to the point that we don't have this dysfunction of war and greed and using other people for our own ends. So yes, it's a very positive picture I see in the future, and it's not even that distant a future. Now we could make a mistake. We could get into religious wars based on who's God's the better programmer because of misunderstanding how reality works. But even that I wouldn't think would last very long. We've been there, done that, and we should know better than to slide down that slope too far. So I suspect even if we did that, we'd come back in maybe another couple of decades. So I'm very optimistic about the future, and I think these concepts hold a lot of promise for the future, as well as answer all, as far as I can tell, the outstanding questions about why are we here? What's the point of being here? How does this reality work? What happens when we die? All of these things just fall out of this model. It answers all these questions. And it answers them in a consistent theory that has only two very fundamental assumptions.
May I ask you, how can we understand these conflicts in terms of countries like North Korea? We know TV is controlled by government and all the people are basically brainwashed. They don't know any other information, and if they will be told to go and kill their neighbors or go with war the United States, they will do that and they will believe they're right. But if it's virtual reality, what these avatars will learn from this? Because basically they're innocent, but they're under influence of propaganda.
Sure. That, in this reality we have free will. And we have free will to make bad decisions as well as good decisions. We have free will to dominate and manipulate other people, or not, or to care for other people. These are our choices. And inasmuch as we make poor choices toward dominating rather than caring, then the system will become dysfunctional and will self-destruct. So eventually the negativity, the fear, the ego, the belief side will self-destruct. It doesn't grow, it doesn't produce, it's non-productive. Look at the way most North Koreans live. Look at that culture, you see. It's not like everybody wants to be like that. Oh, I wish we could be like North Korea, almost nobody wants to be like that because it's a horrible situation. So that's not something that grows. That's something that only diminishes. Sure, you can have those kinds of things for a while, but eventually they just self-destruct because they are high entropy. High entropy is a thing that sows the seeds of its own destruction as it goes. So that will disappear on its own. That will just disappear. It's not long-term stable. Things that are abusive, things that are uncaring, things that are self-centered are not long-term stable. They disappear in time. You may have a regime that is very ugly and very very abusive of its people, but those are all unstable. Usually within 20, 30, 40 years, maybe 50 years at most, you have an overthrow of that. But if the people haven't changed, you just get something back just like it. But then that gets overthrown. This kind of meanness or nastiness just doesn't last. It'll keep destroying itself. Even if you keep putting it back, eventually it will go away as the rest of us evolve. You can't, it used to be that you could kind of lock up the borders of your country and they didn't see or hear anything other than what they were fed. That's getting harder and harder to do. It used to be that was easy to do because you controlled the borders, you controlled everything else, but it's hard to control satellites that fly around the world. It's hard to control devices that are as small as wristwatches that can pick up signals from satellites and display information from elsewhere. It gets harder and harder to isolate in a world that's shrinking like ours is with the technology. So yes, that can last for a while, but it's not long-term stable. It will go away. So those kind of regimes will disappear eventually as we grow up, if we grow up. If we don't grow up, then we'll have to put up with that sort of thing a lot longer. If we do increase the quality of our consciousness, it'll go away more quickly. And I might add that there isn't any way you can change that except change yourself. It's all about consciousness, and you can't change anybody else's quality of consciousness. You can only change your own. So if you want to save the world, start working on your own quality of consciousness. That's the only way that you can save the world, and that's the biggest contribution you can make. Anything else is just working at alleviating symptoms. Those symptoms will persist and persist. They'll just change form, change names, change methods, but they'll still be the same thing until we change ourselves. And that can happen one person at a time, changing themselves. There's no other way to do it. You can't force anybody else to be different than they are.
What about these people who are coming from war, from battlefields, and a lot of them have issues like going back to normal life? They have PTSD, they have problem with alcohol, their family fallen apart by statistic 50 to 60%. Is there any way to help them to go back to normal life? Is there any rehabilitation from your point of view?
Yes, there are ways to help them, but it doesn't mean those ways will be successful with everybody. The fundamental problem with people like that is guilt. The fundamental problem is they have seen and they have taken part of and have been part of things that were horrible, were very, high entropy things to do. And because of that, they have guilt that they carry with them. That guilt is very dysfunctional. It eats at you and it just builds. The more you struggle with it, the more it eats you away. So it's a degenerative kind of thing. These people generally, if there's no help to get out of it, they don't get better. They usually get worse.
Commit suicide.
Yeah, commit suicide is one of the things that's pretty common in that group because it gets worse with age. You find it harder and harder to live with yourself in time, and if you're violating very fundamental things, very fundamental issues and problems, then you very fundamentally feel wrong and feel guilty about it, and that's the key. So the way to help these people is to help them deal with that guilt and let it go. Help them let that go and go on with their life. They can go on building a life if they can let go of that. And many of them, of course, that guilt will be shoved down to a point that they can't see it because they don't want to see it. So it's something that they don't necessarily even know they have. They just know that they have this anger that boils up or this insecurity that boils up. They're afraid. They've seen a lot of things they've seen a lot of other people afraid. And it's just that's the big thing. Sometimes they just see these things, and there's a certain amount of damage you can do to a psyche just by witnessing horrendous things. Children who happen to see their parents murdered in front of their eyes or something, they'll have some damage to them. It makes them insecure. It'll make them afraid of going out in the world. So you have some of that too that isn't necessarily guilt, but just trauma from things. But most of it's guilt. Some of it's just trauma. And in trauma, you have to let those people accept what happened and let it go. Same idea.
Thank you very much for your time and efforts trying to explain and help. And hopefully it will also help a lot of people in Ukraine and Russia also to evolve and grow up, and hopefully all conflicts and wars eventually stop.
I think we have a chance of getting there even in the next 2 or 3 decades. It's a possibility. We can see big steps forward. It's not assured, we may not, but at least it's possible. So thank you for inviting me here and taking the time to do this video so that we can get that word out. And if there's any of your listeners that would like to publish or translate, I'd love to get this into the Russian language and the Ukrainian language.
I will try to translate the interview, and I hope maybe we can find people who can help to translate the book.
Good. Thank you.
Thank you very much.